we're discussing how to encourage people to speak up when they have concerns about how work is being carried out or how others are behaving. For leaders, this is critical to building a positive culture in the organisation and to managing business risks successfully. After all, no one wants to be the next Enron, Carillion, or Wirecard hitting the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Having well functioning risk and compliance teams with clear policies and processes is an essential starting point. But how do you go beyond this so that everyone in the organisation understands what's expected of them and shares a strong sense of responsibility for the way that work gets done? Bringing their experience and expertise into this conversation today are my two guests, Sisieta Owen and Britt Johnston. Sisieta is a global risk and compliance executive whose purpose is focused on doing the right thing. She has led global teams in implementing risk and compliance programs in a range of industries and organizations, including Binance Exchange. Britt is a managing director and the head of conduct and culture for EMEA at Natixis Investment Bank, and she's spent most of her career in fixed income sales. She has also served as chair of Women in Natixis Network and is a founding member of the Inclusion and Diversity Committee at Natixis. Welcome to the Business of Being Brilliant, Sisieta and Britt.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Thanks for having us.
It's lovely that we've been able to make this happen. It's taken a little bit of time and diary coordination, but we have done it. And I will say up front that both of you are here kind of sharing your personal views on the topic we're going to be discussing, and you're not formally representing your organisations in this conversation in any way. So diving in to this conversation, I guess, I just mentioned then in the introduction just two or three of the very well-known kind of corporate failings and frauds that have hit the headlines over recent years. And I guess a lot of people will think, risk and compliance, it's all about avoiding, disasters. And I guess in some sense it is, but it's also really at its heart about creating a culture where people feel able to speak up about anything that's concerning them. So anyone listening to this podcast, I think we're hopefully going to take quite a lot away from it in terms of just how you create a culture that encourages people to speak up and how you support them when, there are concerns one way or another. But let's get, for the benefit of anyone who might not be that familiar with risk or compliance, and I really appreciated you both explaining this to me in our previous conversations. What is the difference between them? Because I wonder if sometimes people use the terms a bit interchangeably. And I know you talk about kind of first line of defence and second line of defence. Britt, can I start with you? Can you offer a point of view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first line of defense would be the business who are the risk takers and the risk owners. And it's important, of course, that they have ownership of conduct and culture. The second line of defense are compliance and risk functions who are the advisors and controllers of the first line. That's how we see it.
Great, thank you. Does that chime with you, Sisieta?
Yeah, exactly that. I think the emphasis there is on ownership. So the first line own the risk, they own the controls, and the second line are there to support and advise, but with an independent slant so they can perform the required oversight to make sure that the risk is being managed how it's meant to be managed. And in terms of doing that, one of the key roles the second line will play is, as Britt mentioned, would be advising the first team and bringing that education to the front line as well, to make sure that there's a real understanding of what to do and how to do it.
Yes, and you make a point there about supporting the front line, the teams that do the day-to-day work and have the conversations with clients and collaborators and partners, but also not being too close. And I guess that's an important point, right? And I know, obviously, Britt, I mentioned in the intro that you've spent most of your career in the business. So you have very close knowledge of that. And I'm sure, Sisieta, you understand as well what it's like to be in the business. And But I guess that's an important distinction. You need to know how work is done and demonstrate that to the people you're supporting, but also you don't want to be their best friend all the time.
So this is where some of the distinction between first and second line might come in. The role I currently have is actually sitting in the first line, and it is enormously helpful to have the business understanding to understand how they operate and understand the business. Because sitting in the first line, my role is more to help them to do business safely, rather than from the control perspective that might be more applicable from a compliance function.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
So you'd often hear the term don't mark your own homework. And I think that's a term that really differentiates the first and second line. As the years have gone by, there's more and more collaboration needed between the first and second, just because there's a lot more understanding needed by the second line and the first line as to what the business offerings are, what they're trying to achieve, so the second line can best support. But at the same time, there's always a grey area to make sure that second line are not involved in the designing of any controls or the creation of any frameworks, because at the end of the day, they have to perform the oversight and reviews and make sure that it's working as it should do.
Yes, that makes sense. And just for clarity, when we talk about risk and compliance, I guess particularly compliance, is this just for industries and organizations that are regulated, or is this about good practice in any organization? Sisieta, what's your thought on that?
So I think it's both, but predominantly we tend to see primary be the regulatory function. So regulated businesses, because regulatory, it stipulates and it becomes a requirement when you're regulated and you're supervised. So yes, regulatory compliance is more common and is primary, but actually you could broaden it, because just focusing on compliance, the term compliance, it means wherever you've got policies, wherever you've got best practices that the organization have adopted as a way of doing things, as a way of working, then there becomes a need to be compliant, whether that's just an internal policy, as opposed to not just focusing on the regulations. So you could, depending, again, I'm not going to skip to culture just yet, but depending on the ethos of the organization, compliance could be seen as a broader term, but primarily you look at the regulatory aspects of it. So regulatory compliance is what drives the need to have compliance frameworks and functions and teams in any business organization.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And Britt, I know your job title includes the word conduct. So would you agree with Sisieta that it's not just about kind of policing compliance with regulations, it's actually about the way we all behave in day-to-day business?
Well, so this is very much where the culture piece comes in, and the way we see it is that, or that I see it, is that culture drives the conduct, and it is imperative to have good governance structures. But the fascinating thing about humans is that they can be rather irrational and unpredictable at times. So from that perspective, it's important to consider the culture and actually start looking also at what some of the drivers for the human behaviors are, to understand why people behave the way they do. And humans are social animals, and we all take cues from the people that we work with, the environment we work in. And that is why the culture piece is so important in terms of having a supportive environment to work in.
Yes. So coming on to that culture piece, why has culture, as I understand it, become an increasingly big thing for risk and compliance functions? Because I imagine going back a few years, it was a lot more transactional than that, or tangible things that you could measure and monitor. But I understand from reading and from talking to you both that actually today culture and how you define it and how you shape it and influence it is something that risk and compliance functions are really, really interested in and focused on. Britt, can you explain a little bit why about that's become so central to these functions?
Yes, and I think this goes back to perhaps the traditional view that the governance structure, with which your policies and procedures and committees, etc., would be sufficient. But actually, the experience on the ground is very often that something else might be happening, and that could be, so for instance, look at where you have say-do gaps. You can have a policy that says one thing, but if the effect on the ground is that everyone's actually doing something else, then that is what will shape the outcome. Which is why it's so important to identify and recognize some of those behavioral drivers. You can say the same about toxic work cultures in terms of bullying, harassment. It can be localized, it can be in teams, which will have a fundamental impact on shaping the outcomes of what happens on the ground. You can say the same about inefficient systems or processes. If you have a very inefficient process, that will inevitably lead, or certainly can lead to, shortcuts and workarounds. So you can have policies and procedures all you like, but if it's not actually followed on the ground, then clearly you find that the governance structure is not sufficient in itself, which is why it's so interesting to look at the human behavior and then the drivers behind that.
Yeah, so interesting hearing that. Is there anything you wanted to add, Sisieta?
Yeah, no, I'll just go back to, your comments around you made about the failings that we've had recently, the firms that have failed. When you track it back, it's down to failures in controls, or the absence, the lack of controls. So, as Britt has mentioned, where you have processes, frameworks, and programs, that's all fine. But at the end of the day, there's a huge dependence of those programs or frameworks being implemented and being embedded within the organization. Now, that itself has a dependency on humans and individuals within the firm to do that. And that's where, it's now increasingly become apparent that that's where the risk, the breakdown of the controls, the failings of the controls being ineffective, often we're beginning to see more and more, it comes down to the implementation and the embedding of the frameworks and programs. If that's not been adopted and is not performed by the various teams or individuals that are needing to use them, then you practically don't have a governance structure. You practically don't have any controls, and you're open to every risk that would happen to the business. And then you end up for a business that have failed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I totally get what you're saying about you can design the best frameworks, the best policies, the best procedures, you can be super responsive on whistleblowing hotlines, all of that. But if nobody actually knows about it, understands it, cares about it, knows and feels safe, right, in using these processes. Because I think hopefully that might, this conversation might be of interest to people listening who might not be in risk or compliance roles, but what they might be concerned about is, as you've mentioned, parts of the organization where they suspect there might be quite toxic team culture, or where people don't feel that it's safe. It could be career limiting, or they might be afraid of, the response or bullying if they do speak out about stuff that's on their mind. So I can understand how actually getting into shape kind of individuals' understanding and encourage positive behavior and speaking up is so vital. So, but to the examples you were talking about how, a lot of these well-known corporate failings have happened because of the say-do gap, and because different behavior was happening day to day. How does that start to happen? I guess there's a process whereby doing things differently, i.e. not the right way, becomes accepted and normal. It doesn't just kind of change overnight. So how do you spot that in an early stage and do something about it? Britt, what's your thought on that?
I think it's difficult to say how you spot it. This is one of the reasons why it's very important to have, firstly, for everyone to be bought into conduct and culture and actually have individual accountability, and for people to understand the importance. I think it's fascinating when you start looking at normalized behavior, because one of the dangers of normalized behavior is that it can be quite a subtle shift, so you don't notice it on a day-to-day, and when you look back you think, how on earth did we get to this stage? For a few years down the line, it may not have started as bad intentions, but if there's nothing to stop you, it can slide. I think when we talk about this, it's for me, WhatsApp is a very powerful example in the banking industry of what became normalized behavior. I'm sure every bank has had an e-coms policy. Yet there's been billions and billions and billions in fines across most banks of misuse at all levels of seniority. And you can ask yourself, clearly people would have known that it was not the right thing to do, but this is where the normalization, where you stop feeling bad because everyone's using WhatsApp. And for me, it's a really powerful example of how things become normalized, even when people don't know that it's not right.
Yeah, and the WhatsApp issue is that, sorry, just to clarify for anyone listening, is that kind of certain work-related conversations shouldn't be happening on those kind of private
on the recorded line. Sorry,
channels.
yes, I should have specified.
Yeah. Okay. Go on, Sisieta.
No, I was also just going to add there, again, coming back to the culture, it's, when you mention about speak up, have the speak up culture, is also making everyone very comfortable to challenge the status quo and not accept, if it doesn't look right and it doesn't feel like, then change it, regardless of whether it's been accepted or it's something that is now classed as, a status quo. And that usually is when I look at firms and we look at, you look at mission statements and you look at the values, I always look out for, where we have values that say, everyone is being empowered to challenge the status quo and not just accept it. So if there's something better that can be done, or if there's something that doesn't look or seem right, be able to speak up and bring the challenge to the table.
Yes. And I'm wondering, listening to that, how practically you do encourage to speak up. Is it because, do people feel encouraged to speak up because they've seen someone else do it and they've seen that they were listened to and supported and that concern was properly explored? Or, do people not speak up because they just don't know what's going to happen if they do mention something of concern, and it's that fear of putting your head above the parapet and diving into the unknown? I don't know what the consequences for me or for my team or for other people in this situation are going to be. Sisieta, what do you think?
It's about safety, isn't it? It's about creating that sort of safe working environment. And that usually comes from tone from the top. So, if the leadership teams are giving out the right energy and sending out the right messages, then you tend to find that, everyone firm-wide is being empowered and enabled to speak up. If the environment, especially the tone coming from the top, is a bit toxic and unsafe, then you find people who just want to put their heads down and do what they have to do in the hours of the day they have to work, and not, do anything else because they want to keep the jobs at the end of the day. So I'll say it's the environment that has been created, because the organization usually feeds off the energy of the leadership team. So if that tone has been sent as saying, look, we do encourage, we want to be compliant, we want to do the right thing, and we encourage doing the right thing regardless, then you will find more and more people being fearless about speaking up.
Yeah. So leaders having lots of regular open conversations about doing the right thing and making that real for people. I absolutely hear that. Britt, is there anything that you've seen work really well around encouraging people to speak up and feel safe?
Yeah, I think for me, the leaders, like Sisieta say, have a big part to play. I think speak up, explaining to people that actually speak up is partly about managing your risk. If you're a leader, you may not be aware of something that's happening downstream. And if people don't tell you, you could have blind spot to it. I think it's important to look at it also from an innovation point of view. If people don't feel safe to speak up, there may be brilliant ideas going around that are not surfacing because people don't feel safe to come forward with it. I think also a good way to look at it is to look to what we call co-create solutions. So speak up is not just about complaining and getting things off your chest, but actually looking to work with the leaders for the leaders to encourage employees to come forward to help create solutions. And I think that's quite a healthy dynamic in terms of working with leaders to work out, because quite often the people on the ground are the ones who are best placed to look at this. So I think, and also it puts into perspective for people the individual accountability. I think that this is a piece that's quite often missing. You think someone else, I've seen something, but someone else will take care of it, someone else will report it. But actually to help people understand that sometimes the leaders may have a more holistic view, and this could be a crucial piece of information that they're missing. So even if you as an individual don't see the full significance of it, a leader might. So this feeds back into the sort of risk management piece of it. Speak up and whistleblowing for me is on the same scale. They're just at opposite ends. So whistleblowing is kind of your nuclear option when everything has gone wrong. Whereas speak up is actually trying to deal with the problems right from the beginning to make sure that you never get to the whistleblowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really clear way of describing it. Thank you. Yes, Sisieta.
No, I was just going to say, and what I also found is providing the mechanisms and tools to be able to do that. So not get to the nuclear stage, as Britt has put it, so not the whistleblowing, and maybe not the sort of, just speaking up or highlighting things that are not going wrong. Well, things that are going wrong, but actually having a real escalation process that becomes part of a mechanism to say, right, if you think XYZ is a risk, these are the steps that you take. So it gets to the right SME, so it gets to the right stakeholder groups. It doesn't matter what it is. If the impact gets assessed and it's medium, high, low, whatever the ratings are, then we would address it. So sometimes I feel having that real process helps the people on the ground, because then it's not just an added burden for them. It's not just something they don't know what to do with it and they just put it, because sometimes it can be very busy, and I do empathize with them, and these things kind of, if they don't form part of their BAU day-to-day job, then it could drop off the side of the desk. But if you can implement it as part of a BAU by having those mechanisms and processes for them to escalate, then you tend to get a lot more out of them as well.
Yeah.
I just watched a fun little clip with Jeff Bezos actually on LinkedIn recently, and he was saying that he always speaks last in every meeting, not to influence the people, which I thought was actually quite insightful, because he recognized that as soon as he said something, other people might find it hard to disagree, because your big leader has said something, and he was advocating for actually always having the junior member starting to talk so they can feel safe to say what they need, and then increase in seniority. So these are other things about speak up, which is quite interesting in the dynamic in meetings and committees, this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And I do use that technique as well when I'm running team sessions. If the team leader needs to be in the room or is part of the conversation, I always coach them beforehand to say, can you try and be the last person to speak up when I'm asking a question? Because A, you'll find it really helpful to get a sense of where everyone else is at, just to check your own assumptions around that. But B, it won't kind of lead the jury in any way. And I think, listening to what you're both saying, I can see how helping people understand what the process is and what support is available if you have a concern about something can really help people lift the burden from people. Because I imagine, if you love your job and you really want to do a good job, or even if you don't love your job but you care about doing it well and having a positive experience of work, then if something is bothering you, that can really weigh on you, and it's like a kind of Chinese water torture, drip, 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 drip. It can really weigh you down, and if you don't feel like you know what to do about that worry. But I also love, Britt, the way you frame it as, yes, it's also about speaking up about the things we might be worried about, but it's also about speaking up about great ideas, and because there's all those opportunities, crowdsourcing brilliant intelligent opportunities from across the organization. It's speaking up about that. So it's a very balanced, it's not just a kind of the policing side of it, it's also about let's harness everyone's great ideas. I think that's really helpful guidance to say for anyone listening. If you want to talk about or create a culture of psychological safety, it's about both sides of the coin. It's about, we really want to hear your ideas and your thinking. So what would be, from both of you, one thing that someone can do very practically to encourage people to be mindful of risk, but also to speak up whether they have a concern or an idea? If you're in a leadership position or managing a team of people and you just want to create that kind of open, transparent culture, what's something practical that you've seen that they could do that you've seen work well? Britt, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, sure. So it could be a survey is always that's a traditional method. Survey can give you great insights, and you can obviously, if you pick up anything from the survey, there are always opportunities to go and do more of a cultural deep dive if there's any specific. So that's always a good way of looking at it. Having culture suggestion boxes, for instance, where people can anonymously submit suggestions they may have without having to put their name to it. I know there's quite often work around having, for instance, a whiteboard. You put post-it notes with ideas that people can come forward. That goes to harvesting the innovation piece again. And then you get ideas that you can then work to implement. And I think also training on speak up and even listen up is actually very powerful, so that people understand their role in this. For me, that's a really key piece. That would be my top tips.
Yeah, thank you. And listen up is about people just listening really well to what they're hearing, what others are raising to them. Is that what you mean?
I mean, quite often, I think the listener piece is perhaps more relevant for the leaders. So you actually need to train leaders in how to listen up, because a crucial piece, if people raise information to you and then nothing happens, it's probably the last time they'll ever raise information. So you need to make sure also that your leader population is adequately trained in how to deal with escalation. So that's perhaps the first piece to put in place, and then you can then train people on speak up afterwards, so that when that process starts off, you have leaders who are competent in dealing with what's surfacing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Really helpful. Sisieta?
Yeah, I think it's always starts with knowing that the business or the firm has the tools and the understanding. So training, I really believe in education, firm-wide education and awareness. And also as a leader, show some vulnerability. We never expected to know it all. So I think, again, that delegating and, holding others accountable always works, because some individuals thrive off accountability. Just knowing, you handing over the task and you're believing that they're capable, because you've empowered, you've provided the tools, you've provided the training and the awareness. And again, like what Britt said, when the escalation does come, then, take it seriously and actually show that, it's been dealt with and it's been addressed. And because that would then go around in a circle and you'd have more escalations coming through.
Yeah. So really recognize when people are speaking up and show people that you're listening and demonstrate that to everyone else, here's what we've been able to do as a result of that. But also to the vulnerability point, I guess that could look like leaders talking about, perhaps as individuals, when they've been uncertain about something, and how they approach that situation. So that people know that, they might have times when they don't necessarily know all the answers or feel 100% confident about a situation or a process or some behaviours they've seen. So I guess talking quite personally about that as well, maybe, how it has felt quite a dilemma for them perhaps to speak up about that.
Yeah, and I think also be visibly seen to encourage diversity of thoughts, which again comes in collaboration. So to your point, crowdsourcing. So wherever there is an issue, drive collaboration firm-wide to try and get a solution. And that's where you sort of, hands up and say, you don't have all the answers, and you're looking for answers, and you're identifying the SMEs within your team. Because at the end of the day, as leaders, that's why you have the teams in place, to be able to drive through using the the expert, the knowledge and skill set to actually drive through solutions, and help inform the decision making that you have to go through. So I think if that becomes very visible, consistently, then you'd have a lot more of the individuals coming forward and wanting to put suggestions forward.
And I think Sisieta also raises a brilliant point around the diversity of thought, because clearly, again, feeding back to the more risk management piece, at least when you make a decision, you have considered it from every angle. You choose your solution in the end, but you can at least demonstrate that you have thought of different outcomes. And this is why you document why you chose a particular solution.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, great. I think that could be a whole podcast conversation in itself about diversity of conversation. We have slightly run out of time to keep following that really interesting avenue. So, but I made a mental note that we might come back to that in another episode. But it's been fantastic to hear your advice and your experiences, and thank you for sharing your expertise around this subject of how you manage, I guess, how you encourage people to do the right thing and to speak up with both their brilliant ideas, but also with any concerns that might feel a bit scary in terms of raising. I think what I'm taking away from it is you can have the best policies and frameworks and processes in the world, but you really have to work in many different ways to instill a sense of individual accountability and make it psychologically safe for people to say what they think and what they see. And a big part of that is being really listening and inviting lots of different views and opinions, and making it safe for people to speak up. So thank you for all your fabulous input to the conversation. If people want to get in touch with you professionally, what's the best way for them to do that, Britt?
LinkedIn.
Okay, and Sisieta?
I'll say the same, LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's invariably the answer. I thought I'd just check. I will pop both your LinkedIn profiles into the show notes. But thank you so much for joining me on the show and sharing your wisdom. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you both. I know I've learned loads about risk and compliance functions in particular as well. You've been wonderful guests. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.